So moving on to talk about some of the ways in which we could perhaps start to overcome some of this kind of poor mental health in academia. I'm just going to refer us back to the Nature article that we talked about in the first part of this podcast. And within that, there was some qualitative data as well. And there is a quote from an academic that said that they were told by a faculty member at their university that if they're not willing to work long hours, then they would need to find a different career. And now I know you've just spent some time establishing that perhaps we can't change the structure of universities, but would you argue that this indicates that there's a distinct need for us to change the culture of universities?
Yeah, possibly. I don't think that particular mindset is that rare, to be honest. For example, I quite often, maybe not so much in the past year, but I have historically worked a lot in the evenings and weekends, basically trying to get ahead, I guess. I guess inadvertently contributing to this culture of increased productivity, but not necessarily in an efficient way.
Sure.
So thinking through how do we change that culture so that people are working within their resources, I guess, while still trying to achieve what they are capable of achieving, what their potential is really important. That said, I think there is something to be said about the flexibility of academia. So it might be that if you are particularly a PhD student, if you don't have the kind of regular academic workload of kind of regular timetabled sessions that you're teaching, if you're finding that you're trying to work on a weekday, and you're really struggling to get into the flow on that day, it's okay to stop working for that day, to take a bit of time out, to try and get some kind of headspace so that you can go and attack that piece of work on another day, whether that is on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon. You have that flexibility. I know academics who are in academic roles that do a similar thing. For example, if I am struggling on an afternoon to kind of get into a piece of work, it might be that I take that afternoon and I don't look at much that afternoon, but then I'll come back to it on a Sunday afternoon when maybe there's less pressure, maybe. The emails aren't always coming in. I'm not distracted with other tasks. So I think there's something to be said about the flexibility of being able to work on a weekend if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
But that is completely different to having an expectation that you work Monday to Friday and you work a day every weekend. It feels like the quote that you read out, there was an expectation that you're basically working 6 or 7 days out of the week rather than 5 days over 7, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100% it makes sense. I think there is a very niche but important distinction, as you've just kind of alluded to that way of thinking. Now, I'm the first one to say that academia is probably one of the best jobs in the world. You know, it might not be the most paid job in the world, but it does come with that level of flexibility that I don't think other roles have. Now, when we talked about kind of not preparing students to go into that role, PhD students to walk into academia, I think one of the key things about that is you're not working 9 to 5. You know, universities are typically in the UK where they're open 9 till 9, I guess. Some programs also teach on weekends, and so you need to be having these carefully constructed conversations with yourself and your peers in terms of these are the hours that I'm working. Actually, as you just said, I might not feel as motivated or passionate about writing in this particular time that I allocated, and so I'm going to be more productive in a different time slot. And I think you actually did a really nice tweet thread on our social media the other day, which basically said, you know, that 2 hours of really in-depth productive work is worth 10 times, you know, like 6 hours of distracted work. And I think we will be going on in kind of future podcasts to talk about some of these strategies where we can consolidate all of our kind of admin tasks and consolidate our writing tasks, be more flexible with this block way of working. But I think it's really important to indicate that there are some individuals out there that do kind of have this culture that, yes, it's not a 9 to 5 job, but you are expected to be working in addition to your contracted working hours. And I think that could potentially, for individuals who aren't prepared to say no, and individuals who aren't prepared for that flexibility, that could come at such detriment to themselves. And so I know that kind of you just spoke about writing, and I know you're a very prolific publisher. So what's your opinion in terms of trying to balance that academic work with this seemingly increased demand to publish as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's an adage, isn't there, in universities, that you either publish or perish. The idea that you have to have X number of papers in a calendar or an academic year, otherwise you're not doing your job effectively. And we all know that there are lots of people who are publishing really regularly, publishing in a range of different journals, lots in the course of their academic life. And it's I think there's a change in how people are thinking about this kind of thing at the moment in terms of quantity versus quality. And I think there's a shift in mindset towards that quality angle rather than quantity. And we're seeing things particularly in psychology where we work, thinking about with the replication crisis.
Of course,
lots of people who are publishing lots of papers that are maybe single studies. Those works typically are not replicating, so there's an issue around maybe quality of some of those papers, whether they've maybe not been thought through enough, whether they've not been run in a way that would allow for replication, is particularly kind of a big issue at the moment. But also thinking about how do we improve the quality of our work as well as improving our productivity. So collaboration is really a really big thing. So we've developed networks with various people. We've been on papers together where we've not actually met the people that we are writing with. It's all been through email or Slack channels or various different forms of communication. But there's lots of kind of these big collaborations now. If you look at the Open Science Framework and what they're doing, getting lots of people to work together on multi-study, multi-site papers where you know that there's good quality in those papers, but also you can reduce your workload and your contribution while still contributing to something that is high quality. So I think that's something that we're really big advocates of actually at universities, and thinking through how do you develop those networks so that you can share the burden of still doing good research, but also not at the detriment of your own mental health.
Yeah, I mean, you know me probably better than everyone. I very much like to work collaboratively with people. I think that by drawing on each other's expertise, not only can you have that kind of sound check in your mind to make sure that your ideas are as strong as possible, but that bleeds into your research, and it makes your research as effective, as impactful as possible. So moving on to kind of also looking at some different ways in which we can overcome poor mental health in academia, and maybe focusing on those PhD and early career researchers. Earlier you made a really good point about how perhaps they weren't being as prepared to going into academia. And so perhaps that could look as something simple as putting together packages or short courses in the kind of meantime to really prepare them for that different walk of life.
Yeah, so I think there's obviously space for these more formalized courses through universities, but I think mentoring is also really, really important. If you can kind of learn from someone that you're working with, if you can almost shadow your supervisor, if they're willing to kind of let you do that, not necessarily kind of attending their lectures and things like that, but kind of having regular catch-ups with them about what's it actually like to work in academia. Yeah. What does an average day, an average week, an average term look like in terms of workload, in terms of skills that you'll need? And thinking about some of those skills that maybe aren't taught formally in undergraduate degrees, master's degrees, in PhD courses, thinking through how do you manage your time effectively in terms of balancing multiple tasks. I think mentoring, coaching, attending talks are just as important as these formalized programs that universities can put together.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I kind of guess just to kind of close out that point, after you've shadowed a potential supervisor, after you've, had these informal discussions that can be really insightful, it might actually be that you come to the realization that undergoing a PhD or engaging in academia actually isn't for you, and I think we will be talking in either next week's podcast or the podcast after about why people might want to choose industry over academia, and just all the kind of discourse around that. But I think it's exceptional that it's exceptionally important to do that groundwork and gain that deeper understanding, and especially in terms of those coaching sessions which you talked about, to prepare yourself perhaps for stepping into that world. And so I kind of guess one of the final potential ways to start thinking about how we might overcome this is to also realize the context in which modern day kind of academia is being run. We've seen that we can deliver really effective teaching in an online asynchronous sphere. Obviously there will be technical issues here and there, but when we are looking at early career academics who perhaps have invested a lot of time and money and resources into completing their degrees, lots of them perhaps haven't been living at home, so haven't been able to have that familial or parental support. We've got an ever-increasing cost of living in the UK at the minute. We're in a crisis with energy bills going through the roof towards the end of the year. Now, academics who perhaps were hired during COVID have got to be making that transition potentially back into the workplace on campus, maybe 3, 4, 5 days a week. That's obviously going to be in the back of their minds, kind of grinding them down as well, and having those thoughts about, actually, I'm really passionate about this job in academia, but I can't see a way of doing the figures so that actually I'm able to have a decent quality of life. And not only have you got that kind of anxiety about this detrimental quality of life, but as soon as you start to not be able to kind of go out for a meal every other week or so, and not be able to spend that time with your family and loved ones, that can potentially proliferate even more kind of depressive or anxiety feelings.
Yeah, and I think just for listeners that maybe are not that familiar with academia, that what you've just said, the picture that you painted there potentially sounds a little bit like first world problems. The idea that we're maybe not wanting to go into work 3, 4, or 5 days a week will be alien to a lot of people who have to do that. And I think there's a reason that we would highlight something like that, because if you are teaching on campus, it might be that you're teaching for a single 2-hour block on that day.
Sure.
Now, ultimately, what that means is that you're traveling into the campus to deliver that session, but for the hour maybe before that session, you're not really doing that much, because you're having to make sure that you're watching the clock so you get to the room on time. For the hour afterwards, you're not really doing that much because you're getting back to your office. You might be grabbing lunch, you might be just decompressing. It's quite difficult to stand and talk at a relatively high level.
Agreed, yeah.
To students for a couple of hours, to interact with them in that kind of high intellectual way for a couple of hours. At that point, that's 4 hours of your day that's gone.
Sure.
You've then got other kind of emails and meetings that you're having to attend, potentially virtually, potentially online, potentially in person. So what you're left with then is, at that single class that you're teaching on campus, which might on your timetable reflect 2 hours, is actually eating 6, 7 hours of your working week. Now, obviously, that's 6 or 7 hours where you're being paid to work, but you're not able to do the work that you are being allocated, which then feeds into everything else that you're having to do, which contributes to that sense of burnout that we've been discussing, that contributes to this general sense of dread that a lot of people have over the sheer volume of work that they have to experience. So what I don't want to kind of leave in the air there is the idea that academics don't want to work 3, 4, or 5 days a week. It's the fact that, so if it's not block teaching, that becomes 4, 5, 6 hours maybe that people haven't been able to do other tasks that they've been allocated, which ultimately means that people are feeling pressure to work in the evenings or the weekends. So it's not that the academics don't want to work 3, 4, or 5 days a week at all. It's about the fact that quite often a teaching load will be a single session. It may be in the middle of a day, and that then sucks all of the productivity out of that day, which then contributes to this spiral of burnout, of feeling like there's not enough time in the day, that then feels kind of anxiety provoking, I guess. So it's not necessarily the number of hours or number of days that people are on campus, it's what that means in terms of their workload and their experience of work. So I think thinking through some of the potential remedies for this, whether we can change that kind of culture of having individual sessions. Can we think more about timetabling in terms of blocking teaching? If you're teaching for 15 hours a week on campus, for some people that might be a heavy teaching load, for others it might be an average teaching load. But if you can teach for those 15 hours over 2 days, what that does, it means that you have those 3 days at home where you can just focus on doing research, thinking about your academic administration tasks, where you're not rushing between classes and kind of wasting those individual hours around teaching sessions. Those individual hours that you claw back quickly kind of compound, so that you then have much more time. So it becomes less about that individual hour and more about the morning that you've just gained back as a result of being at home rather than on campus.
Yeah, and I kind of guess so 3 points there, and I'll try and take them in turn. It can almost be completely redefining your mindset. You know, like having that shift isn't just about shifting your location, it's about changing the way that you then go on to approach that day. And if we are instilling this really positive, efficient mindset in students and academics, then actually you are going to see that shift towards a more productive base. I think the second point is, I think will be a trend within this podcast series, there's lots of very nuanced elements which have emerged, and actually every one of the kind of 3 mini sections today we could have expanded into a larger podcast in itself. So that's something which will hopefully be kind of adapting on and spending more time, and also kind of cherry picking those debates that are raised throughout each podcast, and maybe delivering some material over social media to kind of explore some of those topics as well. And I kind of guess the final point before we close is that it seems from what you've just established there that we've been able to come full circle. So we started off by identifying that there is this pervasive increase in poor mental health, which is international. It's being faced by PhD students, early career academics, and I would say, you know, more late stage academics as well. We have focused this podcast more on PhD students and early career academics, and perhaps how they've not been as prepared as possible to not only undertake that doctoral study, but also go into that early career role. And a mixture of competing tasks, perhaps an inability to say no, teaching schedules which might not be as efficient as possible, all of which accumulates with individuals feeling that they haven't achieved what they're expected to achieve, which might not be measurable, each day and across each week, which then perpetuates feelings of, well, I need to work evenings, I need to work weekends, which then maps very cleanly back into the start of the cycle of, well, now I've not spent time with my family, so I'm feeling low mood, and I know I've got a really busy week next week, so I need to prepare for that on a Sunday, and so I'm feeling anxious about that. And you can see how this cycle is just going to escalate.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Completely agree. These things aren't easy to solve, but I think there are some things that universities can do in terms of timetabling. There are things that supervisors can do in terms of mentoring and training, informal training. There are things that individuals can do in terms of blocking their time, in terms of improving workflows that they won't solve all of these issues, but they will certainly help to alleviate some of these negative feelings that they're having, I think.
Perfect. So I'm going to draw the podcast to a close. Thank you very much for Craig for joining me today, and also for our listeners who have subscribed to the podcast. Remember that you can catch this both on YouTube every other week, and also on all of the places where you hear all of your podcasts. It should be really accessible. In the meantime, please do follow us on our social medias. We're trying to grow this community. We're trying to grow that Discord community of like-minded students and early career academics who really do want to make a difference. We'll see you next time.